Hello, I'm Amy the Amazonian, and in this video I'll be talking about 30 brand new cards coming to Magic the Gathering Arena as part of Murders at Karlov Manor, Alchemy. These cards are going to be playable in Alchemy, Historic, Timeless, and Brawl, formerly known as Historic Brawl. That's my personal favorite format. And it's not just new cards, it's also a brand new mechanic, which I'm going to show on this first card here, Scrutiny of the Guild Pact. Scrutiny of the Guild Pact is a 2-mana enchantment that gives your multicolored creatures +1/+1, a nice anthem for those colorful creatures you might control. But it also has, when Scrutiny of the Guild Pact enters the battlefield, you may choose a creature card in your hand. If you do, that card perpetually incorporates 1 white mana and gains, when you cast a spell, create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token, which I'll point out is a multicolored creature token. So what this means is that when this card enters the battlefield, you get a card in your hand, altered. It's been perpetually changed to now have 1 extra white mana as part of its casting cost. And when it's cast, not when the spell resolves, you get this additional creature token. There's a cycle of these incorporate cards that are a part of this set, and they all have something that's on cast, which is great because it's a lot harder to stop something that's an on cast ability than something that's just a spell that has to resolve. You can still stop it with a Tail's End or a Whirlwind Denial, but cards like this are really nice. And Scrutiny of the Guild Pact specifically is great with multicolored creatures, and it can even create that multicolored creature, and additionally, perpetually change one of the creatures in your hand to be multicolored. This thing is working in so many different ways. I think my favorite place that I would like to see Scrutiny of the Guild Pact is something like an Aragorn the Uniter deck. He's already 4 colors. He cares about the colors of the spells that you're casting, and he really likes it when you have a lot of multicolored spells. So Scrutiny of the Guild Pact and the other incorporate spells are going to be fantastic with them. This is also something you could just play in a simple detectives deck. The Detective Lord, the thing that gives your other detectives +1/+1, is a blue and white creature. Your tokens are going to be blue and white, and there's going to be a lot of clues abound for you to track down with Scrutiny of the Guild Pact. So let's take a look at the next of these incorporate cards, Mapping the Maze. Mapping the Maze is a 2-mana blue instant. You can choose an instant or sorcery in your hand or graveyard. That card will perpetually incorporate 1 blue mana and gain, when you cast this spell, draw a card, turning anything into a cantrip. Then you return a multicolored instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. Now some of you are already thinking, oh, you use the blue that you've incorporated into the cost to make a spell into a multicolored spell. And that's exactly how this card works. You can choose to incorporate, let's say, Lightning Bolt from your graveyard to get 1 extra blue mana. It now costs 1 red and 1 blue. When you cast it, it deals 3 damage to any target and draws you a card. This is a nice way to recur a specific kind of spell from your graveyard to your hand, but in a deck that already has a lot of multicolored spells, this is going to be pretty nice. The original 5-color Niv Mizzet, I think, is a great card to include something like Mapping the Maze in, or if you're just looking to bring back a little bit of extra value from something like Key to the Archive, where most of the spells are actually already 2-color spells, or not in blue, so you can incorporate that blue, bring it back, and then, I don't know, cast Jay of Judgment again. Also drawing a card. This seems like a very specific card, but a good card to have if you are a spell slinger. Moving on to Lurking Spinecrawler. Lurking Spinecrawler is a 4-mana 5/4. This is kind of nice. I like something that's 4-mana 5/4. That can trade with Sheoldred. That's important to me. When this enters the battlefield, you may choose a non-land card in your hand. If you do, that spell incorporates 1 colorless and 1 black, so it costs 2 more mana and gains. When you cast the spell, each opponent sacrifices a creature, and each opponent who can't discards a card. This is great because it forces your opponent to lose something unless they have no creatures and no cards in hand, in which case you just played a 5/4. You're already doing just fine for yourself. This is requiring you to cast an additional spell to get this effect, but I do think that this is pretty strong. And on top of that, this also has, whenever you cast a multicolored spell, such as the spell that you incorporated black into, for each of that spell's colors, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. If you're playing something that has a ton of multicolored spells in it and is in black, something like maybe Omnath, I don't know, I like a good 5-color deck, this could get you a lot of gain and drain because it's for every single color of the cards that you are casting. Also, I am wondering if somebody's going to try to do something interesting with this and the new 5-color Leyline card. Ooh, Lurking Spine Crawler about to crawl up in those 5-color decks. Imagine if you cast a 5-color Leyline for 4 mana and it deals 5 damage to each of your opponents and gains you 5 life. That would be amazing. For the red card in this cycle, we have Construction Arsonist. This is a 2-mana 2/2 that is a Goblin, Rogue, and Wizard. Those are all relevant creature types, by the way. Goblin decks are very fun. Rogues and Wizards are both party creatures, and Wizards have their own archetype of deck. When Construction Arsonist enters the battlefield, you may choose an instant or sorcery in your hand. If you do, you add an extra red mana to its casting cost, and it gains. When you cast this spell, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. Because this is part of this multicolored cards matter, it also has, whenever you cast a multicolored spell, Construction Arsonist gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each of that spell's colors. I feel like a lot of decks running a burn sort of deck aren't going to be running that many different colors, and incorporating red might not change the colors of that many spells. But if you put Construction Arsonist into, say, an Aragorn United deck, that's getting you a lot of extra burn to your opponent, and if you cast something like Aragorn Uniter, then you end up getting +4/+4 on this creature, so you can swing in for a lot of damage. Because this is only a buff until end of turn, though, it does go away, and in the end, you're really going to have to rely a lot on that burn to close out games. The last in this cycle is the Guild-Pact Green Walker. This is a plant rhino, and it's also a 3-mana 4/4. This is a very green card, but it does care about multicolored creatures because when it enters the battlefield, you may choose a creature card in your hand. If you do, that card perpetually incorporates 1 colorless and 1 green and gets +4/+4. Yeah, that's a big buff. And multicolored creatures you control each get Ward 2. So this is a bit of protection, and it's a huge buff. It can only buff things in your hand, which means that if you're looking to, say, perpetually buff up your commander in Brawl, it's going to be a lot harder to do. But if you are just trying to make some really big creatures in, say, a Gruul aggro deck, you're going to have a ton of fun with this card. I feel like the card I would most like to see this played with is Helana and Elena, but unfortunately, because it is not in Alchemy right now, you'd have to play it in something like Historic or Timeless, where it might be a little slow. There's plenty of other great beater creatures that getting +4/+4 is going to be an amazing buff to their stats. I'm looking forward to seeing what absolutely steamrolls me when people are playing the Guild-Pact Green Walker. So those are the 5 of these cards that have the new Incorporate ability. Being able to manipulate the colors of cards in your hand and in your board and in your graveyard is a really cool new way to play the game, and I'm sure people are going to pull off some wild multicolored things with cards like this. Now moving on to the non-incorporate cards, Case of the Market Melee. I love that name, Case of the Market Melee. Good sounds in there. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to any target. It could be your opponent's face, it could be a creature, it could be a planeswalker, it could be a battle. Damage is not removed from creatures during cleanup steps. This means that if you put 1 damage on a creature, at the end of the turn, it's going to still have 1 damage marked on it. Something that is different between this card and some similar cards, though, is that this is for everybody. This is a symmetrical case. To solve this case, 3 or more creatures have to be damaged at the end of your turn. And then, once the case is solved, whenever you attack with 1 or more creatures, the case deals that much damage, the number of attackers, as you choose among however many targets you want. This is so strong once you solve this case. But solving the case might require a little bit of injury to your own creatures. Case of the Market Melee, I think, is going to be tricky to solve, but so satisfying when you do. A nice aggressive burn deck, this discourages your opponents from blocking, because even if they do block, that damage is staying on their creatures. So I feel like maybe a tokens deck or a mono red burn deck would love to play this card. It also works really well with cards like End the Festivities that deal 1 damage to each creature that your opponent controls. That way you will have a lot of damaged creatures all in the same turn. Make it a lot easier to solve this. The next card is my personal favorite, and you're if for people who watch my content, you'll know why. Because Juggle the Performance is a little bit of crime, and it's crime for everybody. I love playing my opponent's cards, and if you do, then this is the card for you. For 3 mana, each player discards their hand, then conjures a duplicate of each of 7 random cards from the library of the player to their right. The duplicates perpetually get mana of any type can be spent to cast this spell. This is so beautiful to me. I love chaos, and I love playing my opponent's cards, and I also like making people whose decks are really, really concentrated on a certain strategy discard their hands. Like, I love making that happen. That makes me happy. And with Juggle the Performance, let's say you only have 1 card left in hand, it's Juggle the Performance, and your opponent has 7. You play this spell, you both have to discard, and then everybody's taking a couple cards from each other's decks. Now, my cards might not be that useful in your deck, but your cards might be more useful in my hand, especially if I don't have the mana requirements I'd normally need to cast them. This is an auto include in a lot of my like Grixis crime decks, and I'm really looking forward to playing it. Plotstring Analyst is a human wizard that knows that a lot of us are willing to pay a lot of life to play our opponent's cards. Notably, this is not a detective. Despite the magnifying glass and the big fedora, this is a human wizard. It's a 2 mana 2/2 in Dimir colors that at the beginning of your upkeep, you exile the top card of your opponent's library face down. You lose life equal to that card's mana value, which your opponent does now know. Your opponent knows the card's mana value, but they don't know what the card is. You may look at and play those cards for as long as they remain exiled, and mana of any type can be used to cast the spells. This is a great way to get some card advantage, but you are going to be losing quite a bit of life. Maybe you'll get lucky and you'll hit a land. That's just free land that you can use. But if you hit something like a 7 mana spell, you're going to be losing 7 life for the opportunity to cast the spell. You still do have to pay mana in order to get those cards into play. Now, shove aside, this is a card that's going to see a lot of play in a lot of different formats. You might know Strangle as 1 mana to do 3 damage to any creature or planeswalker, but shove aside, it can sometimes have Flash. This is a sorcery that becomes a sorcery with Flash. Yes, I know, it's a sorcery with Flash if you aren't the starting player. This is just a great piece of removal for red. I certainly would put this in my Ragavan decks and a lot of other just mono red decks in order to use it as a strong piece of removal. It's able to kill most creatures that come down in the first couple turns. It's able to take out a lot of those lower cost planeswalkers or just finish them off. And the fact that it can sometimes be cast as an instant is pretty exciting. Also, I just think it's very funny to have a sorcery with Flash. Let's go, whoever designed this card. You're speaking my language. Relics of the Rubble Belt is a green ramp spell that uses artifacts generated by a sorcery. This spell allows you to draft from the spellbook twice. So it will show you 3 cards, you pick 1, and then it will show you 3 cards, and you pick 1, and then you can put 1 into play tapped, and 1 goes into your hand. Now you're wondering, what is the spellbook for this? Well, it's simple. It's the signets. It's all 10 of the signets. The signets, by the way, are 2 mana artifacts that you pay 1 tap to generate 2 mana. So they gain you net 1 mana. And the signets, if you're not familiar, are the Simic Signet, Orzhov Signet, Golgari Signet, Selesnya Signet, Cruel Signet, Rakdos Signet, Izzet Signet, Dimir Signet, Boros Signet, and Azorius Signet. That's right, there are 10 of them. I think I said all of them there. I'm sorry if I missed one, but this is a nice way to get some cool artifacts entering the battlefield triggers for cards like Sarenth Steelseeker. There's a bunch of cards that care about having more artifacts, and since one's even in your hand, if it cares about casting an artifact, you can trigger it with that too. I think that Maria and other similar legends will also really like Relics of the Rubble Belt because they are getting you mana and they're getting you more artifacts to use for abilities. Speaking of spellbooks, Amara, Voice of the Conclave, is a creature with Convoke that generates more spells with Convoke. This is a 3 mana 2/3 that you can tap your creatures in order to help pay the costs of, and when she enters the battlefield, you draft a card from her spellbook. And what's on her spellbook? Well, it's only cards with Convoke. Overwhelm, which is a huge way to buff up your creatures. Triplicate Spirits, which helps you go wide by making a couple 1/1 flyers. Loxodon Restorer, who gains you life. Venerated Loxodon, this is actually one of my favorite cards, which buffs up all of your creatures, and it's also a 4/4 that you can cast for 0 actual mana. It's amazing. Conclave Tribunal, a nice piece of removal. Knight Errant of Eos, which gives you card advantage and a strong creature, and March of the Multitudes, which can go super wide. But in case you just wanted one really big creature, on that spellbook is also the Ancient Imperiosaur. These cards are all fantastic if you have a lot of small creatures. I'm talking about tokens and just cheap creatures. This is also fantastic with cards with Vigilance, because it means that you can attack in with a card with Vigilance and then tap it in order to cast one of these Convoke spells. Amara, voice at a conclave, truly speaking to the Selesnya soul in each of us. Oh, also, I forgot that Nissa's Expedition is also on that Convoke spellbook. If the spellbooks are a little bit too unpredictable for your taste, the It Polarizer will always give you what you want. For 2 mana, you get a 2/1 creature, and when this creature dies, you either get a copy of Ionize, a counterspell, or Electrolyze, a burn spell that draws you cards into your hand. These are both situationally very good cards in It. And because you do not reveal your choice to your opponent, you can sit there and make them think, oh, you have a counterspell, or oh, you can deal 2 burn damage to whatever target you please. Maybe you want to split that damage up because you have something that's increasing your damage dealt to different targets. There's a lot of great ways to use these cards, and the It Polarizer gives you a nice early creature that can trade on the board, or you can just use to attack your opponent. Eventually, they're going to want to get rid of it because it's still doing 2 damage at a time when it attacks in. Tajik Legion's Valor is Aurelia's greatest soldier, and he brings an army with him into the battlefield. This is a 4-mana 1/1 with Indestructible and Haste, but he does not stay a 1/1 for long. At the beginning of combat on your turn, he gets a +1/+1 counter, and then you conjure a card based on the number of 1/1 counters into play. They have haste, and it has to attack this turn. So on the first time that he gets one of these counters, you get Boros Recruit. That's a 1/1 with first strike. On the second one, you get Swiftblade Vindicator. That's a double strike vigilance trampling 1/1. For the third one, you get the classic Sky Knight Legionnaire. For the fourth one, Spark Trooper. Gets sacrificed at the end of turn, can gain you some life too. And then at 5, you get Aurelia, the Law Above. So at this point, by the way, Tajik is a 6/6 creature, and you've already gotten tons of value out of him. And since Tajik is indestructible, he can just sit there and grow and grow and grow. And even though you only get those 5 creatures, he'll still keep getting +1/+1 counters. And let's say you don't care that much about getting a Sky Knight Legionnaire or a Spark Trooper, you can actually accelerate Tajik's abilities by putting additional +1/+1 counters on him using cards like Luminarch Aspirant. That's a great choice for most aggressive decks. I think Tajik is going to be a really great commander. Having an indestructible card that's generating more creatures for you, especially good aggressive creatures, is an easy sell for people who want to deal damage to their opponents. The Simic Guild really does have the most innovative and interesting cards, at least when it comes to Rolesque Prime Specimen they do. This is a disguise creature, which means that you can play it face down for 3 mana. It's a 2/2 with Ward 2, and then you can turn it face up for only 2 mana, 1 green and 1 blue. You could also cast it for 4 mana and have a 4/5 flyer, but you really do want to be turning this face up because whenever this or another permanent you control is turned face up, you may pay X. And if you do, assuming X is 1 or more, you conjure a duplicate of a random creature card with mana value X into your hand. It then gets cloaked, which means put face down into play, and gets a 1 mana ability to turn it face up. This is a way to continuously get more and more value based on how much extra mana you have, and generate random creatures. If this sounds kind of familiar, this is a Momir-like ability, and I love to do a little bit of random creature generation. Sure, sometimes you get something lackluster. You get a 1/1 for 3 mana that doesn't do anything because it didn't enter the battlefield. It came in face down. But sometimes you'll get some really spicy, interesting cards. It is notable, though, that you don't get enter the battlefield. That's why I'm saying it, because they all come into play cloaked, which means face down with no abilities. This is also just like you turn something face up and you pay 1 mana and you get another 2/2 with Ward 2. That's just a great bit of value. And if you're playing a cloak/disguise deck in Simic colors, Rolesque is going to get you a lot of really good value. I think that this is a fun card. I'm looking forward to trying to build him as a commander. Spotlight Falcon is the first card on this list that has Collect Evidence as part of its abilities. For 4 mana, you get a 4/3 flyer, and as you cast the spell, you can choose to collect 5 evidence from your graveyard. That's 5 mana value or more worth of cards being exiled from your grave. When it enters the battlefield, if you did collect evidence, you get another Spotlight Falcon into your hand. That means that you can keep getting more birds to pressure your opponent, and if one of these birds dies, it can actually be used to collect evidence. That's right. These go to your graveyard just like any other card. They are conjured, which means that you're fueling your graveyard to make even more falcons. A nice white flyer, and it's also an artifact if that's something that you're building around. Scourge of Scene is a 2 mana white and blue enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, it gets you a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. This is a blinkable ability, which is kind of nice, and whenever you sacrifice an artifact with this on the battlefield, you can choose a creature you control or a creature in your hand and give it a perpetual +1/+0. This is really nice if you're sacrificing clues or treasures or even food, just a way to get something extra out of your artifact sacrifice. Sloth Instructor is an elephant that will teach one of your creature cards how to cloak themselves. The Sloth Instructor is, by the way, such a great name for this. This is a 3/2 for 2 mana, but it also has a disguise cost of 2, so you can pay 3 mana, play it face down, and 2 mana to flip it face up. And while it's face up on the battlefield, if it or another creature is turned face up, you get to seek a non-elephant creature card with a mana value of 3 or less and cloak it, which gives you even more presence on the battlefield. Notably, this ability only triggers once, so once the Sloth Instructor has taught a lesson to another creature, the lesson is forgot. You know, some elephants, they never forget. That this one, he forgot once he did it once, which is a darn shame. Still a very cool card in a deck that's trying to go wide with lots of disguised creatures, or just trying to bring out interesting creatures into play as a mystery. Speaking of mysteries, the Ominous Lock Box will keep your opponent guessing until you copy their cards. This is a 2 mana clue, which means it can be sacrificed for 2 mana to draw a card, but it also comes into play, and you secretly choose a number between 1 and 20. When an opponent casts a spell with that mana value, you get to copy that spell, and you can choose new targets for the copy if it's something that's a targeted spell. This is a cool way to copy something you know your opponent has. Or you could just kind of guess and say, well, I know that their kind of deck plays a lot of 3-drops, so I'll name 3, and when they play their good 3-cost card, I will also get their 3-cost card. Ominous Lock Box is a very interesting design for a card, and I do like the hidden information aspect. It feels very Murders at Karlov Manor. Emporium Thopterist is a blue creature that makes all of your Thopters stronger, and it also gives you Thopters to cast each turn. Emporium Thopterist is also a non-legendary card, which means that you can play multiple of them to make a real Thopter army. This is a 2 mana 1/1, gives your Thopters +2/+0, and gives you an Ornithopter at the start of your turn. This plays really nicely with other cards that also generate Thopters, like Pia Nalar, Sai, Master Thopterist, Sihili Filigree Master, and Tezzeret, Artifice Master. There's a ton of cards out there that can repeatedly generate Thopters, and some of them care about you casting more and more artifacts, which synergizes super well with that getting a free Ornithopter ability, since it goes into your hand and it's a free spell you can cast. I actually do think that this is going to see play in a bunch of different decks, and I'm looking forward to seeing the army of little tiny Thopters get bigger and stronger and swing in for a ton of damage. I actually had to look up how to say this. It's Excogitate Sphinx. Ooh, a 4 mana 4/4 Sphinx Detective. And whenever one or more creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, you investigate, getting you a clue, which you can use for some card draw. You can also pay 1 and sacrifice a clue to seek an instant or sorcery card, which means that you can fill up your hand with a specific kind of card instead of just drawing a card for 2 mana. This is a fantastic card for things like Lonus, which are generating a lot of clues, or a lot of just mono blue decks that are looking to be evasive and go in at your opponent. Since you can seek instants or sorceries if you have a deck that's full of counter spells or bounce spells, you're going to be able to get these on demand by sacrificing those clues that you get by attacking your opponent. And since this has flying, it's going to be easy for this to swing in and hit your opponent. I feel like this would play really nicely with a card like Malcolm, since it's a good, flashy, evasive creature that's almost guaranteed to hit in a lot of games. Snarlfang Vermin passes on the disease of suspicion. This is a 1-mana 2/1. That's a great early attacker that can deal combat damage to a creature. And if a creature is dealt combat damage, well, that creature gets suspected and gains the ability whenever that creature deals combat damage to another creature, it gets suspected. When a creature's suspected, it gets menace and can't block, which means that you might end up with a very diseased board from this rat suspecting each of your creatures, in turn suspecting even more creatures, back and forth and back and forth. It's just a very unusual creature that could absolutely make a game get out of control while nobody is able to block and everybody wants to attack. Really speed up the game with a Snarl Fang Vermin. It also has the extra ability of whenever a suspected creature an opponent controls dies, if this is in your graveyard, the opponent loses 1 life. So just a bit of extra drain. That's always nice to have, and doing more damage off of a 1-mana 2/1 means that this card is definitely going to hurt your opponents, either by making their creatures suspected or by hitting them in the face for 2 at a time. Perforator Crocodile is amazing. Let me just start with that. And I'll also say that this is going to remind a lot of people of Massacre Worm. It's a 6-mana 6/5. It costs 3 black, 3 colorless, and when it enters the battlefield, it gives all of your opponent's creatures -2/2. But it does so permanently by actually generating a stab wound, conjuring it, and attaching it to each of your opponent's creatures. This means that you kind of want your opponent's creatures to survive the -2/2 because at their controller's upkeep, they're going to lose 2 life for each stab wound that's on their creature. This Perforator Crocodile is so good, and it's great on its own. It plays really well with other cards like Ariette that care about your opponents having, auras on their cards. But this also has the double amazing, triple mega bonus of having cycling. This is a reanimation target. For 2 mana, you can put this into your graveyard from your hand and draw a card, and then you could bring it back with whatever reanimation spell you'd like. And because that's an enter the battlefield ability, you can give your opponents so many stab wounds, which might just kill them on their next upkeep. Cackling Observer is a card that reminds me a lot of Elite Spellbinder, but in black and kind of more amazing. This is a 3-mana 3/1 flyer. Great, it can deal some damage in the air. When it enters the battlefield, your opponent is going to reveal each non-land card in your hand. You choose one of those cards and exile it. And the card you're exiling is permanently exiled. It's no longer in the game. Then, when this leaves the battlefield, whether it's bounced or it dies or it's exiled, doesn't matter, the exiled card's owner will seek a non-land card with a lesser mana value than the exiled card. This means that you aren't just getting rid of your opponent's card, you're also making it so whatever card they get later, it's going to cost less and probably be a less powerful card than the one that you exiled. Cackling Observer is going to be a must-have in black aggressive decks across whatever format you want. And having that targeted hand hate is always good to have. Sure, you've seen Thoughtseize, but that puts things in the graveyard where they can be reanimated or brought back. Cackling Observer, this thing exiles. Concert Kabus is that sweet spot between Storm and Disguise. It's a 3-mana 4/2 Goblin Artificer with Trample that is going to deal damage directly to your opponent based on the number of non-creature spells you've cast since the beginning of your last turn, which means you can turn this face up on your opponent's turn, and it will still count any spells that you've been casting on your previous turn, as long as they were non-creature spells. It is Disguise cost of red, and it seems like it would play really nicely in any red storm deck, like Urabrask or Burgi. Pyrotechnic Performer is also something that would play pretty nicely with this, just because this is a very cheap Disguise cost to turn face up, so you can deal more damage to your opponents. It also would be nice to put this into something like a Yaris Roar of the Old Gods deck, just because it's another good card with Disguise, and the more good cards with Disguise you have, the better Yaris is. Sproutwatch Dryad is a card that cares about abilities, and those are abilities that are either on your creatures or on creatures in your hand. This is a 3-mana 3/3 that at the beginning of each combat, yours and your opponent's can get Flying, First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Trample, and Vigilance if one of those cards in your hand or on the battlefield already has those abilities. Now, this is pretty great with something like Glissa in Alchemy, because that is a First Strike Death Toucher. What an amazing combination of abilities. But it's even better if just in your hand you have a card like Zetalpa, which has Flying, Double Strike, Vigilance, Trample, and Indestructible. because now you'll have all of those keywords on this 3/3. It can swing in, deal a lot of damage, and your opponent can't deal with it during combat because it's even indestructible. Stratwatch Stride is definitely cool if you care about keywords. Woodland Investigation is a nice way to get a land, any basic land, and put it into your hand, but that land does perpetually become a clue, which is both good and bad. On the good side, it means that once you don't need that land anymore, you can sacrifice it for 2 mana and draw a card. The downside is artifact destruction can destroy your lands with Woodland Investigation, which can always feel kind of bad. So you have to be very careful about playing the spell against red decks or any other deck that has a lot of artifact destruction. Looks like Simic's at it again with the Rampaging Ursaguana. They took a lizard, they took a bear, they smushed it together, they turned it face down so nobody knew what it was, and then they let it attack in. And each time it attacks in, it secretly gets +2/+2. So when you flip it face up, it can become a giant creature. This is a 6 mana 4/4 with Ward, Trample, and Haste on its own, so you could just play it from your hand, attack in with it, it becomes a 6/6 attacker, and that's pretty nice. But if you're playing it face down, it overall costs 1 more mana. You can pay 4 to undisguise it to reveal it to your opponent, and then it can be this sudden huge attacker with trample that your opponent can't deal with. The Ursaguana, a nice finisher in green. In the Orzhov Syndicate, your spirit is never truly lain to rest. Veos Doorkeeper is a 2 mana 1/3 with Extort, which means that when you cast this spell, you can pay an additional black or white mana, and your opponent will lose 1 life and you will gain 1 life. You can also use this creature's ability to sacrifice a non-spirit and bring a creature from your graveyard to your hand. That card perpetually becomes a spirit, has a base power and toughness of 1, and also, this is amazing, can be cast for 1 mana. That means that you could do something like, I don't know, sacrifice a zombie token in order to bring a Perforator Crocodile back into your hand, and then cast it for 1 mana. Now that Spirit of the Crocodile will only be a 1/1, but it will still get all those sweet enter the battlefield stab wounds. So with anything that's got a good enter the battlefield ability, you're going to be doing a lot of work with Veos, especially because there are many different cards that will generate tokens for you to sacrifice to Veos. Yeah, it just says non-spirit. Sacrifice some zombies. There's plenty of them. Skeletons too. Rats even. Oh yeah, you could sacrifice a rat to bring back a terrifying crocodile. Case of the Lost Witness features everybody's favorite homunculus, Fubblthup, the Lost. When this case enters the battlefield, you conjure 4 Fubblthups into your library, shuffle it up, and then draw a card. In order to solve this during your end step, you have to control a legendary homunculus. But once this is solved, you can cast spells and play lands off the top of your deck, so long as this case is in play. For only 2 mana, that's an incredible ability. And before somebody says, oh, but it's so hard to solve, it really isn't, especially not in Brawl, where Fubblthup could be your commander. Or if you're looking for something that's a little bit more powerful, Borborygmos and Fubblthup. It just says you have to control a legendary homunculus, and with 2 eyes and a creature type of homunculus and Cyclops, Borborygmos and Fubblthup fits the bill. I would say that this is a great card to include in that deck, because for 2 mana, being able to just keep on getting cards off the top of your deck, that's fantastic. And even just playing lands, you're going to be doing, you know, a lot of work. Augur of Autumn's out here just like, I wish I were that awesome. And I also wish I were in blue. I think that this is a great card, though. It's very fun. And come on, who doesn't want to play more Fubblthups in their deck? And now the final card I have to reveal is Fergo Nurturer. This generates leeches, slimy dual leeches. Gross. This is a 4 mana 2/4 elf shaman. At the beginning of your end step, you conjure a slimy dual leech onto the battlefield if you control no leeches. But if you do control leeches, then you put a +1/+1 counter on each leech you control. There's not that many leeches in Magic, but if you really want to build around them, Fergo's your guy. This also has the additional ability of being able to tap, sacrifice a creature, and add an amount of green mana equal to that creature's power, which means that each turn you could generate a leech and then sacrifice it to Fergo. This seems like a kind of 1-card engine for any deck that cares about creatures dying each turn, like Smeagol. Smeagol's great, cares about your creatures dying, or if you just kind of want to get a little bit of extra mana. The funniest thing you could do with Fergo, though, is make it so you always have leeches. By which I mean turn all your creatures into leeches using something like Maskwood Nexus. Why not just put +1/+1 counters on all your creatures? You don't need more slimy dual leeches. You just need to buff your creatures. And Fergo will definitely do that if you have a Maskwood Nexus out. Thank you so much for watching as we went through all 30 of these new cards and the new Incorporate mechanic. If you're looking for more of my content, you can find me at twitch.tv/Amazonian and youtube.com/Amazonian. I stream almost every single day, so there's always fresh content to be had. And also, thank you so much to Wizards of the Coast for asking me to make this video. I loved getting to see some of these new cards, and I'm really looking forward to playing with some of them, especially the new Legends and Brawl. Thank you so much for watching!